Okay, now the final speaker is Aron Betru, and he knows quite a lot about procurement and the flow of funds in emergencies and how to arrange these better. So, how can you? What can you say about the role of guarantees in improving the funding for the the flow of goods that are necessary for an emergency response? And also, could you describe the partial guarantee concept and how it can help close liquidity gaps during a time when goods and services have to be delivered very, very quickly for an effective response?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I guess what we're all seeing here seems somewhat aligned, that it's not just about the money that's being put to bear. There's a series of other tools and processes that need to go along with it to make sure that it's utilized efficiently and quickly. And it's based off of kind of two competing things that are going on in most of these countries. On one side, as was rightly said, we've got controls and governance issues that we have to put in place that largely is the reason why cash seems to be needed at every stage of the process. But unfortunately, that's using a system that is going back centuries where cash is actually used for everything. And while on the other end of this, there's a phenomenon that sometimes people get sick at a pace that does not involve the budgetary or the funding cycle. And what do you do when a pledge is made and cash doesn't show up months later, 18, 24, or 6 months, or rightly said, a week matters. I can't remember who authored this, but a couple of months ago I saw an elegantly terrifying article about, in the first couple of days if the resources were made available, the amount of funding that was needed was in a couple of millions of dollars. And a couple of weeks or months later, if those resources were available, it was in the tens of millions. In 6 months later, it was hundreds of millions, and the last figure north of billions. So I have to point to this fact in terms of the speed at which money flows actually really matters. There was a Brookings Institute article that actually tried to quantify all these little inefficiencies and said, for the past 15 years, the speed of aid is such so that the inefficiencies that it garners has probably wasted roughly 28 cents of every dollar of overseas development assistance. Now think about that in terms of the amount of money that we were trying to mobilize across every one of the pandemic responses. If you were able to either cut the cost by 28 cents or what that means in terms of the value that you were able to garner. And the funny thing in all of this is, I'm sure a couple of folks in the private sector here are smiling, because what does the private sector actually do in all of this? I was recently having dinner with an engineer that actually helped build a number of cell towers and bridges and dams throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and he gets paid by either donors or national governments. And these payments, he says, I really don't know exactly when the money's going to come. I take them to a commercial bank, and they give me a little credit insurance on top of it, and they discount exactly what that invoice is going to be, and they give me the money because I need to pay my employees today, I need to buy my inputs today, and it does not mean that I have to wait 6 months, 12 months. They do what is called receivables financing. Now, the somewhat sad part in all of this is a number of stakeholders actually foresaw this. The Gates Foundation in particular, and a number of others, created a program called Pledge Guarantee for Health. Simple story. In 2011, the government of Zambia was waiting for a World Bank disbursement for the purchase of malaria bed nets. They went through all the different protocols of approval, and then when it came to effectively the disbursement timing that was needed, it wasn't anyone's fault. It would just so happened that the stock of nets that were in the country was insufficient for the next rainy season. And so the procurement officer said, well, wait a second, we need to procure by December 1st. Unfortunately, the approval of those funds was not going to come until December 9th. Forget about when does the actual cash actually show up, which probably would have been 6 months later. So what do you do? And what this program did was effectively it placed a guarantee with Standard Bank of South Africa in Zambia. Now, the question ended up coming, well, wait a second, what are the systems and the laws in place to tap this? And what they didn't realize, originally everyone assumed when you engage with the private sector financial markets, you need parliamentary approval to mobilize and borrow. What they didn't realize is when you're borrowing for less than 12 months, it's a non-balance sheet transaction. It's a cash management tool. Within 3 weeks, the nets were made available and they started flowing. When all the protocols were approved, the funds from the World Bank were made available, they paid back the commercial bank, and things moved on. This was a very small pilot example. There was a couple other ones in Ethiopia, Ukraine, Philippines that were tested out, and effectively that in a development context, you can tap the private financial sector markets to mobilize quickly. And if you do it in a prudent way, it's not loan shark rates, but it's actually somewhat in an efficient manner to move resources. Now, the sad part, as I was saying, is this program was actually in the learning stages and did not become operational until the end of the Ebola crisis. Luckily, the US and Swedish governments have actually now backed it up with a $100 million guarantee fund where its sole purpose is, as donor funds become real, to place financial guarantees with financial markets and have these lines of credit available to mobilize rather quickly. So these tools are available and they're out there. And I think the comment that was made at the beginning in terms of we seem to live in silos and there's learnings that sometimes only get observed and never really pushed forward. So I would say at the beginning, it really makes sense to look around. You have some tools available to you. It's mobilizing them in a manner that actually gets them available for countries in advance.
No, that's great. Now, could you say something about whether it would make sense to prepare these arrangements as part of preparedness in advance of an emergency, or is this something that's, can be practically done as sort of transactions move along during an emergency? Do you have any, has it been done anywhere as a preparedness mechanism? Because we know that donors are sometimes slow and cumbersome and unpredictable.
Yeah.
And so if the government wants to be ready, maybe they could be having these guarantees prearranged.
No, I completely agree. And I hate dealing in emergencies, largely because mistakes happen. Inefficiencies are glossed over, and effectively we can't squeeze out the efficiency gains to get back what Brookings identified as 28 cents. And I'll give you an example of that. And I really like the comment around what Mexico did. You had alerts first, you spend triggers second, and then you reconcile the funding later. That's not how it happens in most of these countries, largely because of the way the cash actually flows. What usually goes on is you have pledges that are made, and effectively, as we think through the monitoring and the triggers that are going to happen in these countries, they may see certain elements going on the ground, and they start to forecast what's the need, and they plan out exactly what is required. Then you go back and you actually figure out when is the funding going to come and make sure that the cash is actually in people's hands. And right there, first inefficiency occurs, because you have donors who have paid for all this forecasting and timing element, which gets thrown out the door, and you have individuals that actually do the spending and triggers based on when the cash actually arrives. Complete disconnect happens. That's error number one. Error number two then ends up being when you go through the procurement process, whether it's personal protective equipment or vaccines or whatever is the case, the cash needing to be in the procurement officer's hands, and then effectively the tenders and procurement orders that go to manufacturers. Manufacturers actually need time. They need time to manufacture the goods, label them, and actually deliver them. And think about it from the perspective of a manufacturer that's given 6 months, a year's worth of warning of what he might need to have earlier in the process, and what that actually can translate to in terms of the price of those commodities being brought down. That's inefficiency number 2. Inefficiency number 3 is we don't all live in the same community. We actually live a world apart, and it takes time to deliver these goods. Now, think about it from the context of when we are dealing with an epidemic, we seem to be comfortable with the idea of emergency logistics and support, flying things all over the world at super high costs. If we actually had resources available to us a little bit further in advance, if we had the ability to mobilize those funds quickly, and you had manufacturers that had been pre-warned of what's actually required, the logistics side alone can actually be a huge area of savings. And so for all of these reasons, yes, it does make sense to have these framework agreements or guarantees in place with both funder, recipient, and the private financial markets being able to move rather quickly.